Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm Miss McConvey and today we're going to carry on with our series on National 5 RUAE. This video has come a lot later than I had originally planned. I originally wanted to do it last year and then I didn't have the time and then I wanted to get them done for the prelims and then quite a few things have come up. So I'm going to do this one and then I'm really going to try and get the other RUAE questions done by the final exam. So even if it's taken a little bit longer, hopefully you'll still be able to use these for revision for your final exams. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. So what do we need to know about imagery questions? Well, they are a type of analysis question, just like sentence structure and word choice questions, which we've already done. They are basically asking you to identify examples of imagery and be able to explain them as fully as you can. They're usually only worth 2 or 4 marks, and I will explain a little bit later on how you get those marks. And also, they are often included more as part of use of language questions as opposed to imagery questions on their own. Before we answer these questions though, it's really important to know what imagery actually means. So when we're talking about imagery in English, we're usually talking about one of 3 main techniques: similes, metaphors, and personification. For most of you, this will probably be revision, but I'm now going to go through each one of those and explain exactly what they mean with examples. So similes are a technique where you compare 2 things using the words like or as. For example, you could have as beautiful as a butterfly, or she shone like stars on a dark night. Metaphors also compare 2 things, but you're comparing 2 things by saying something is something else, not saying it is like something else. So for example, they had a heart of stone. It's not saying it was like they had a heart of stone, we're saying they do have a heart of stone. In the same way, if you say life is a roller coaster, you're not saying life is like a roller coaster, you're saying life is a roller coaster, okay? But obviously, you cannot literally have a life like a roller coaster. Additionally, you cannot actually have a heart made of stone. You would be dead. Personification is where you give an inanimate object human traits or characteristics. Fun fact, it's also the opposite of objectification, where you treat a person like an object. For example, the lightning danced across the sky. The lightning cannot actually dance. It doesn't have arms, it doesn't have legs, it doesn't have a sense of rhythm. Additionally, the last cake was calling my name. The cake doesn't have a mouth, it cannot shout, and if you were to eat a talking cake, that would get pretty dark. And that is personification. You're treating an object like a human. I would say that comes up ever so slightly less often in RUAE papers than similes and metaphors, but still keep an eye out for them anyway because they might be there. It's important to remember that similes, metaphors, and personification are all about comparisons. So let's look at a really rudimentary example just now. For example, he was as tall as a tree. Well, what do we know? Well, we know that the boy must be tall. And why do we know this? Because he's being compared to a tree. A tree is something that we recognize as being quite tall. So therefore, we are taking the characteristics of the tree and we're comparing the boy to those characteristics. So by saying that we know the tree is tall, we therefore must know the boy is tall. So in this case, there is a literal meaning, the boy's height, and there is a figurative meaning, as tall as a tree. You will need to be able to identify a literal meaning and a figurative or made up meaning when it comes to actually answering these questions, which I will go on to show you now. So there's a couple of ways of answering this question. You can either use quote and explain, that's enough to get you the marks at National 5, or you can use the TQAL structure, technique, quotation, analysis, link. Small disclaimer though, always go with what your teacher has asked you to do. It makes it much easier for them to help you when it comes towards the exams, if they know exactly how it is that you're answering the question. Anyway, however you choose to answer those questions, you'll still use just as, so too. Just as, so too is your way of showing that you understand the comparison that is being used in the image. So you will say just as and then explain the figurative meaning, the made up meaning, so too, and then explain the literal meaning. What is the real thing being compared in this example? So if we apply just as, so too to our earlier example, then we get just as a tree is tall, so too is the man very tall. Okay, the first bit is our figurative meaning, the bit that is being made up, the bit it is being compared to. Then talking about the man being very tall, that's our literal meaning. That's the thing that is real, is the man's height. Okay, so once you understand that, then you can start to use it in answering practice questions. So for example, this one. The champion hurdler leapt over the fence like a gazelle. Obviously, in the RUAE paper, your passage will be a little bit longer, but I was running out of space on my board. So the question is, by referring to one example of imagery, explain how the athlete jumped over the fence. If you're just doing quote and explain, the first thing you need to do is to write down the quote. Write down the relevant image. Don't copy the whole passage, just copy the bit that is important. So the simile, the metaphor, or the personification. Remember, at National 5, you do get a point for quoting, so you should never leave that blank. If it is an analysis question, then please write down a quote, because you will not get any points if you leave it blank, but if you have a guess, there's a chance that you will get a mark. Okay, it's important to note as well that you don't get that at higher. You need to be able to explain as well at higher. But for National 5, quote, write something down. Once you've written your quote, then you need to do your explanation. So in your explanation, you have to explain why the way the hurdler jumps is being compared to a gazelle. So we know that a gazelle was able to jump over something with grace, with power, with ease, with a lot of height, and so therefore we know that the champion hurdler is able to jump the fence with a lot of power, with a lot of grace, and with a lot of height. Once you've figured out how it's being compared, then you just use just as and so to structure your answer, as I've done here. For those of you who use TQAL, I'll go over that just now. So you start off with your technique, which in this case is imagery. Now I think it's quite important that if you can recognise what type of imagery it is, whether it's a simile, a metaphor, or personification, you write that down. I just write that down in brackets next to my technique. Then you need to find your quote. So in this case, the champion hurdler leapt over the fence like a gazelle. Again, pick out just the simile or metaphor in the paper. Then you need to do your analysis, and your analysis is where you use your just as, so to. So just as, figurative meaning, so to, literal meaning. Then you just need to make sure you link it back and you actually answer the question, okay, as I have done here. Just going to round off then with some top tips. So my first one, and the one that I recommend all the time, is to read. Read as much as you can. Good quality journalism is the best. Please read things from The Guardian, The Independent, National Geographic, BuzzFeed's old long read articles. These are all really, really good. Also, I recommend The Guardian because it's free and you can access it online. So read as much as you can. These are the kind of articles that you will be expected to read and answer on in the reading paper. My second tip is to highlight or underline. You should be able to write on the exam paper, so if you highlight and underline your examples of imagery, it'll make it easier for actually writing your answer down, because you're not having to search back through the text for it. My next tip is to never leave it blank. So for these types of questions, you get a point for a quote. So write down a quote, okay? If you don't answer the question, you get a maximum of 0 marks for that question. Whereas if you write something down, at least you've got a shot. And lastly, remember that you're trying to understand the comparison between two things by looking at what is similar. If you are not confident in similes, metaphors, and personification, I would really recommend that you go and look for some examples and see if you can identify those two things that are being compared, because that is going to help you when you answer these questions. Right, that's all I have for you guys on imagery questions. I'm really sorry it took me so long to make this video. Hopefully it won't take me too long until I make the next one, which is probably going to be tone and use of language, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you very much for watching, and if you have anything you would like to tell me, let me know down in the comments. Bye!